The case of Hugh Despenser, 1326. The air in Hereford was heavy with the smell of death that day in November, 1326. A crowd gathered, drawn by the promise of blood, vengeance, and justice. Men, women, and even children pressed forward, eager to watch the downfall of a man who had ruled England through fear and cruelty. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, the hated favorite of King Edward II, and his end would be one of the most gruesome spectacles ever witnessed in medieval England. But to understand how Hugh came to be strapped to a scaffold, awaiting one of the cruelest executions in history, one must first understand the darkness that clung to him throughout his life. Hugh Despenser was not born a monster. He came into the world in 1286, the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a powerful baron who would himself be pulled into the whirlpool of his son's ambition. From his earliest years, the younger Hugh was ambitious, ruthless, and greedy. He was clever enough to know how to climb, and cruel enough to never care who was crushed beneath his feet. By his 20s, Hugh had married into immense wealth through Eleanor de Clare, the granddaughter of King Edward I and niece of Edward II. With her inheritance, he became not only rich but dangerously close to the throne. His rise was swift, his appetite insatiable. Lands, titles, and power were never enough. He wanted more, always more. When he caught the eye of King Edward II, his fate was sealed. The king, a man often described as weak, pliable, and desperate for affection, fell under Hugh's spell. The two became inseparable, and soon Hugh was not just the king's companion, but his most trusted advisor, his confidant, and according to many chroniclers, perhaps his lover. Whether that rumor was true or not, the bond was strong enough to make Hugh untouchable. And untouchable men often become monsters. With the king's ear, Hugh tightened his grip on England like a noose. He seized estates from other nobles, dispossessed widows and children, and filled his coffers with stolen wealth. He humiliated barons, imprisoned rivals, and carried out brutal acts of violence against those who dared oppose him. His cruelty extended even to the queen herself, Isabella of France, Edward's wife. Hugh mocked her, sidelined her, and even tried to take her lands. Isabella despised him with every fiber of her being, and she was not alone. The barons whispered his name with hatred. The common people cursed it in the streets. He was called the tyrant, the destroyer of the realm, the evil counselor. But Hugh was not content with wealth and power. He wanted terror. He became infamous for his sadistic punishments. Prisoners were starved, mutilated, or executed in ways that made others tremble. His enemies met grisly fates. Some hanged, some castrated, some flayed. He took pleasure in breaking men, not only their bodies but their families and their legacies. He was said to delight in humiliation, in twisting the knife not just in flesh but in the very soul. In one tale, he ordered the hanging of a rebellious noble's wife and children before the man's very eyes. In another, he seized a rival's land and made the man live long enough to see it handed to Hugh's own followers. His cruelty knew no bounds, and with the king shielding him, no justice could touch him. But power built on fear is a fragile thing. By the mid-1320s, England was boiling with resentment. Queen Isabella, humiliated and enraged by Hugh's grip over her husband, found an ally in Roger Mortimer, a powerful Marcher lord who had himself suffered under Despenser's wrath. Together, Isabella and Mortimer planned not only revenge, but revolution. In 1326, while Edward and Hugh grew fat with stolen wealth, Isabella sailed from France with an army, landing in England with her son, the future Edward III, at her side. Nobles who hated the Despensers flocked to her banner. Towns opened their gates to her. England rose like a wave, and for the first time in years, Hugh felt the ground tremble beneath him. Edward and Hugh fled. The king was still loyal to his favorite, but loyalty could not stop the tide. They ran west, desperate for allies but found none. Edward was captured, stripped of his crown, and imprisoned. But Hugh was reserved for something far worse. Dragged in chains before Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer at Hereford, Hugh Despenser was about to learn what justice looked like when dealt by those who had suffered under his cruelty. The chroniclers describe the scene with grim satisfaction. Hugh, once clothed in silks and jewels, now stood trembling in rags. His face was pale, his body gaunt from days of flight and imprisonment. He was given no chance to speak, no chance to plead. His crimes had already been decided. Treason, theft, sodomy, and unspeakable cruelty. His sentence was not death alone, but degradation, torture, and spectacle. On November 24, 1326, the crowd gathered in Hereford. A great gallows had been erected, taller than any seen before. At its center stood a scaffold, and upon it Hugh Despenser was brought. The people jeered, spitting, shouting curses, eager for the man who had tormented them to taste agony. The executioners began by stripping him naked, an act not just of humiliation but of symbolic degradation. Around his neck, they placed a crown of nettles, mocking the power he had stolen. Then came the torment. He was tied to a ladder, his body stretched out as the executioners went to work. Before the crowd's horrified but eager eyes, Hugh was castrated. His genitals were cut off and burned before him as he screamed. Then, with knives, the executioners sliced into his flesh, opening his abdomen, pulling out his bowels piece by piece. His heart, it is said, was cut out and thrown into the fire. Still, the torment was not complete. His body, now ruined, was finally cut down, his head severed from his shoulders. His remains were quartered, sent to the corners of the kingdom as a warning to others who might follow his path. His head was placed on the gates of London, a grisly trophy for all to see. The people rejoiced. The tyrant was dead, his power broken, his memory cursed. But in the silence that followed, one truth remained. The cruelty Hugh had inflicted upon others had been repaid upon him, measure for measure. The story of Hugh Despenser is not merely one of ambition and downfall. It is a mirror of the medieval world itself, a time when power was seized with blood, when mercy was rare, and when justice often meant suffering as cruel as the crimes it punished. His life was a lesson in greed, in arrogance, and in the terrible price of tyranny. For the people of England, his end was a spectacle of vengeance. For history, it remains one of the darkest tales of medieval justice, a reminder that in that age of shadow and fire, the line between ruler and monster was as thin as a blade. And for Hugh Despenser, the man who once held a king in his hands, his legacy was written not in glory, but in screams, blood, and ashes. The autumn wind carried the chill of death through the streets of Hereford, but the people who pressed together that morning cared little for the cold. They had come for blood, for vengeance, for the fall of a man who had ruled England with greed and cruelty. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, and though once he had been draped in silks and bathed in the glow of royal favor, today he would be stripped bare, broken, and fed to the fire. His end would be one of the most savage spectacles the kingdom had ever witnessed, a punishment so cruel it would echo in whispers for centuries. But Hugh's story did not begin on a scaffold. It began in privilege, in ambition, and in hunger. Born in 1286, Hugh was the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a baron with power enough to command respect but not enough to command fear. The younger Hugh was clever, ruthless, and restless. Those who knew him in youth spoke of a boy who wanted everything and would stop at nothing. Fortune smiled upon him when he married Eleanor de Clare, granddaughter of King Edward I and niece of the reigning king, Edward II. Eleanor's inheritance was vast: lands, titles, wealth, and with it, Hugh found himself catapulted from a grasping minor noble into the ranks of the realm's great lords. But riches alone did not satisfy him. Hugh had a taste for dominance, for cruelty, and for bending others to his will. It was in King Edward II that he found his perfect partner. Edward was weak, a king plagued by insecurity, forever in need of companionship and loyalty. Hugh became that companion. The two were inseparable, and soon, Hugh's influence over the king grew suffocating. Chroniclers whispered that their bond was more than friendship, that Hugh shared Edward's bed as well as his counsel. Whether or not that was true, Hugh's control was undeniable. He was granted vast estates confiscated from others, showered with titles, and given near total command over the realm. And with power came cruelty. Hugh's rule was marked not by justice or fairness, but by greed and sadism. He stripped nobles of their lands, even widows and orphans. He used his position to enrich himself and his family, often at the expense of those who could not fight back. He punished enemies with imprisonment, torture, and death. He was said to take particular delight in humiliating his victims, ensuring that they suffered not only in body but in pride. The people hated him. He was called the destroyer of the realm, the black dog of the king. To the barons, he was a tyrant who wielded the king's authority like a butcher's knife. To the common folk, he was the face of their misery, a leech who drained England for his own excesses. Even Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, was not spared his venom. Hugh sidelined her, insulted her, and even tried to seize her estates. Isabella despised him with a hatred that burned hotter than any other. But Hugh did not care. Protected by Edward, he believed himself untouchable. He strutted across England like a dark prince, his arrogance growing with every act of cruelty. It was said that when he captured enemies, he starved them in dungeons until their screams faded into silence. One tale tells of Hugh forcing a captured baron to watch his wife and children starve before killing him. In another, he ordered a noble castrated for daring to cross him. His hands were always reaching, clawing for more, and in those hands men were broken like twigs. Yet every tyrant eventually sows the seeds of his own destruction. By 1321, Hugh's abuses had pushed the barons into open revolt. They marched against him, demanding his exile. For a brief moment it seemed they had won. Edward reluctantly sent Hugh into exile across the Channel. But Hugh was never a man to accept defeat. He lingered close, whispering through letters, scheming, plotting. Within a year, he returned at Edward's side, his power restored, his vengeance swift. Those who had dared to rise against him were hunted down. Their lands were seized, their families ruined, their bodies broken on the gallows. It was a reign of terror. Hugh and Edward became tyrants together, ruling not by law but by fear. The realm bent beneath them, yet rebellion simmered still, waiting only for a spark. That spark would come from the one person Hugh had underestimated most, Queen Isabella. Humiliated, cast aside, and stripped of her wealth, Isabella bided her time. In France, she found an ally in Roger Mortimer, a powerful Marcher lord who hated Hugh as much as she did. Their alliance was more than political. Some whispered of passion between them, of a bond sealed by love as well as ambition. Together, Isabella and Mortimer plotted revenge. In 1326, their plans ignited. Isabella landed in England with a small army, her son Edward, the heir to the throne, at her side. The kingdom rose to her banner. Nobles who had long feared Hugh now saw their chance for freedom. Towns opened their gates, peasants cheered, and England turned against the king and his hated favorite. Edward and Hugh fled. They galloped westward, desperate for safety, but none was to be found. Allies turned them away, castles closed their gates, and the land itself seemed to spit them out. Betrayed, abandoned, and hunted, they were finally captured. Edward was taken prisoner, destined for deposition. But Hugh was saved for something far worse. He was dragged in chains to Hereford, where Isabella and Mortimer waited. The queen who had once suffered his insults now held his life in her hands, and she meant to make his end an example so terrible that no tyrant would ever forget. The sentence was already decided. Hugh would not simply die. He would be broken, humiliated, and destroyed piece by piece before the eyes of the people he had tormented. His punishment would be treason's due, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But for Hugh Despenser, the executioners prepared something even more savage, a torment designed not just to kill, but to annihilate his very memory. On the 24th of November, the scaffold was raised high, towering over the square. Crowds poured in from miles around. They wanted to see the monster fall. They wanted to taste vengeance in the air. Mothers held children on their shoulders. Old men leaned on canes, and thieves jostled with knights, all united by hunger for blood. When Hugh was brought forth, a hush fell. The man who had once strutted like a king now looked gaunt and broken. His fine clothes were gone, replaced by filthy rags. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Still, even in chains, some said he tried to hold himself tall, as though defiance could save him. The jeers began. Stones were thrown, spittle flew. The people roared their hatred, a storm of curses that drowned the bells of Hereford. For years they had lived under his shadow. Now they would watch him burn in the sun. The executioners moved quickly. They stripped Hugh naked, mocking him as the crowd laughed. A crown of nettles was thrust upon his head, a cruel jest for the man who had stolen power like a king. Then he was tied to a ladder, his body stretched out for all to see, and the knives came forth. The chroniclers do not spare detail, and neither did the executioners. Before the eyes of the crowd, Hugh Despenser was castrated. His genitals were cut from him and cast into the fire. His scream tore through the square, high and terrible. A sound some said was not human but beastly, the bellow of a soul dragged into hell. Then, while he still writhed in agony, the executioners opened his abdomen. They cut into him, pulling out his bowels slowly, feeding them into the flames. The people watched, some cheering, some silent, all unable to look away. The tyrant who had made England bleed now bled before their eyes. His punishment was not quick, nor merciful. It was drawn out, each cut measured, each scream prolonged. His heart was cut out and burned. His body was hacked into pieces, quartered, and sent to the corners of the realm. His head was set upon the gates of London, a grim trophy for all who entered to see. And thus ended Hugh Despenser the Younger, the king's favorite, the tyrant of England, the black dog who had bitten too deeply. His life was written in greed and cruelty, and his death was written in fire and blood. But the memory of that day lingered long after the ashes cooled. For in the end, Hugh Despenser's story was not just his own. It was the story of an age when power was seized by claw and blade, when justice was as cruel as the crimes it punished, and when the line between ruler and monster was drawn not by virtue, but by fear. And for those who walked away from Hereford that day, the echo of his screams followed them, a reminder that tyranny ends not with silence, but with the roar of a crowd and the crack of the executioner's knife.